All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Intro to Firebase Realtime Database and Authentication. I just wanted to mention one real quick thing on Techlahoma donations that Vance didn't mention. Those are actually tax deductible. So if you donate to Techlahoma, they're actually tax deductible. And sometimes you get really cool things like T-shirts like he has on and polos like I have on. So. Yeah, the polos were for the founding members. I'm not sure if we have them for the annual donations, but really cool T-shirts like this are for everyone. So real quick about me, my name is Kristin Ferrier. I've been in IT for more than 18 years. I currently have my own company. I'm principal consultant at Ferrier Solutions. I'm a full stack web developer with a specialty and passion for data. And I'd love to hear from you guys on Twitter. SQL Energy or Techlahoma Slack is Energy Dev, and I'm Energy Dev on GitHub. If you see me someplace and don't remember my name is Kristin, but you remember SQL Energy or Energy Dev, I will actually respond to that, and that has actually happened. All right, so what we're going to cover Firebase, two portions of Firebase, and how it can help you build your applications faster. We're going to talk about Firebase Realtime Database, and we're going to talk about Firebase Authentication. So let's say you've got a React web app or an Android app or an iOS app or just one of those, and you need all of them to share the same database. You need to have them share all the same authentication, and you want that out there available in the cloud somewhere. Then Firebase Realtime Database is an option for you, and the Firebase Authentication is an option for handling authentication as well. You can use those separately or together. So let's first talk about Firebase Realtime Database. So first of all, who's familiar with SQL and has worked with an SQL database? Who has worked with a no SQL database? A couple of people. So Firebase is a no SQL database, and then within the NoSQL set of families, it's a document database. And the data is stored in JSON. So instead of it being in tables like you would see in SQL, it's stored in JSON. And here's actually an example of some database from a really small Firebase database where basically the data is in the form of JavaScript objects. So when you manipulate data in SQL databases, you use SQL. So if you've got a JavaScript app or React app that is accessing Firebase, you're not actually going to use SQL. You're actually going to use JavaScript. So here's actually some real code from a React app. The import database up here is where you're actually pulling in the Firebase library, and then this database.ref users UID expenses.push expense is where you're actually pushing an expense object, a JavaScript object, into Firebase. So validation and security. One thing to think about in the cloud, no matter what you're using as your database as a service, is someone may try to access your database without using your application. So you need to have it locked down at that level as well. So database security rules are provided within Firebase. And we'll actually look at an example of this actually in a real Firebase database. But basically, there's a section where you can enter JSON data to provide user authentication validation and then also validation. So in these two examples that we're going to look at, we're locking down to make sure that a user is authenticated, that they're only manipulating data for the section that they're authenticated to see for their user data, and that they're only going to insert expenses, that they're not going to try and insert other things. So this portion here highlighted in red is basically saying you can only manipulate data in the system if you're authenticated, and you can only modify data for your actual user's data. And then this next portion is basically saying, hey, you can only enter expense objects, and we've got some other restrictions here related to the expense objects. So super important, make sure you set up your security, because if you don't set up your security, the default, like we see down here at the bottom, is read and write. Now you might say, hey, well, what if they don't have the 5 different keys that are needed to access the Firebase database? Well, one of those keys is actually discoverable, can be seen from the login screen, and if you're not locked down, and I've personally seen this done, they can just add a .json to the end of your database name and read the entire database. So even if they don't have those 5 keys, you've got them locked down somewhere, there's one of them that's discoverable, and that's enough to read the entire database if you don't have it locked down. So it's very, very important if you've got a real production database that you've actually locked it down in Firebase. And last I checked, the default was not locked down. So A little bit of information on Firebase Authentication. It can be used without Firebase Database, or it can be integrated in with Firebase Database. And it allows you to use authentication, email, password, phone, Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of different options, and that functionality is built in for you. So for example, we've got this login with Google link, and if you just want to click that button and have it pop up what we've got on the right, the choose account, all you've got to do is write code like this here, import Firebase and Google Auth provider, and then this line right here is what's going to actually provide the pop-up for you. And it just automatically does that for you. So Firebase Authentication, it can integrate with Firebase Realtime Database. You can use it as a standalone Firebase feature as well. A couple of things to be aware of. Whenever you're using any kind of cloud service, make sure you check out the pricing plan. Last I checked, the first one for Firebase that defaults starts out free, but then they start charging you money, and there's no cap. But there is actually a free plan out there, so definitely make sure you check. But the free plan doesn't have the automated backups. So once you get into production mode, you're probably going to want to be on a paid plan. And one thing is Firebase Realtime Database does not handle arrays, but there is a way around that, and you can do that in your app. So one of the key benefits is you can write your applications more quickly. I did want to show you an actual Firebase database. So this is actually, we're in Firebase itself, and they have a lot more functionality than just database and authentication. But you can see here, we've got the database for Expensify and the user data here. You can actually manipulate it here. You could actually delete data there if you wanted to directly. And here's the rules where I was talking about the security rules that we have right here. So that's just basically a quick overview of how things look out. You see backups here, it says, hey, you need to upgrade to actually get the backups. And then you can actually see your usage, which would be relevant to once you get onto a paid plan. And then getting started, you just go to firebase.google.com. There's lots of great examples out there. Then also I have an example that integrates a React app with a Firebase app, and that's the second link here. And then you can catch up with me later on Twitter at SQL Energy or EnergyDev. That's my talk. Yes, Vance. You want to come up here? I have used it. It's been a little bit, so I'd have to pull up a code example and see if I could find it. Yes. Yes, so Vance is asking if we can show an example of using the arrays. It's been a little while since I've worked on this app, so we'll see if I can find it. This is Visual Studio Code. Yeah, you're so awesome. Well, one thing we can also look at is the login authentication. So here's an example of some login authentication where you're actually wanting to check. Oh, let's make this bigger. One great thing if you're ever working in Visual Studio Code or SQL Ops Studio, which is based off of Visual Studio Code, you can do Control+ and Control- just to zoom that one item. So here's actually an example of more authentication where it's basically looking to see if authentication state has changed, and if you are not logged in, it will take you to the login screen, and if you are logged in, then it will take you to the dashboard. But let's look for Firebase. It's been a couple of months since I've worked on this app. This is actually some of the code actually right here. We're pushing, yeah, this is actually code right here, where it's basically just the expense object itself is getting added, but then we're dispatching the actual code that's going to add it to the array in the local Redux store. So that's what it's basically doing in this case, is it's basically using it as an array with the Redux score, but when it's pushing it to the database, it's using it here. And this is an example of getting the user ID corresponding to the user, because if we look at the app, because this is actually the database for this app, this is the actual user ID right here. So we've got the user, and then we're putting their user ID there. And then the expenses is what we would have had an array for. So in this case, it looks like what it's doing is basically it's only using an array when it's storing in the Redux store. And if we look at edit expense, this should be in here. Start edit expense, here's where that code would be. Yeah, so basically in this case, what it looks like it's doing is basically it's only storing it in an array when it's in the Redux store, but when it's actually pushing it to Firebase, it's dealing with the individual items. I don't know if that answered your question or not. No, didn't answer the question. Yes, Logan. So the question is the database a RESTful API? It definitely is an API that you're contacting. Okay, so you're talking to it in the same way. Basically, you're giving URLs, and that's how it accesses the database. I haven't personally tried to put in a full URL into Google to say and try and look at a specific user's information. I've only tried to do it from JavaScript. But this is essentially, yes, you could essentially kind of consider that the end of a URL, because it is an API. Any other questions? Yes.
For the auth, are you limited to just those providers that they list out, or can you provide your own?
So the question on the auth is, can you provide your own? So you definitely can create your own authentication. I haven't tried to tie that in directly to Realtime Database, but there's nothing stopping you from using, say, their authentication and then your own custom. I just haven't tried to tie that together. I think that you can create your own and tie it in. I just haven't looked into that capability. Any other questions? Yes. So it sounded like the question was if you have a message between two users. Yes? Right. Right. So I haven't worked with group authentication in Firebase, but if one user sends another user a message, you could theoretically store it underneath both users, and then authentication would handle it that way. Any more questions? All right, that's it. Thanks.